ahead of elections. It's unprecedented. Even around the world, one of the few instances where such a pre-election coalition would have been cobbled together, almost there. So they've reached common ground on the key solutions to the challenges facing South Africa. Now, it's quite important getting an agreement on that. I mean, it's, just in normal practice, it is often very difficult because we all, as individuals, we have different opinions on how to deal with the challenges of a country and also political parties. And in order to reach a common agreement on some of the key things really is groundbreaking. And I must also reiterate that the convention, it was not the first time that the partners have been talking to each other. So I've been chairing, coming into the negotiations, chairing and the negotiations prior to the conference. And obviously, this convention is meant to really iron out the last of the issues and between the parties, and to get that formal agreement and to build a trust between many parties that have in the past obviously competed very vigorously against each other, often in a very hostile way against each other, and now have to agree to partner in a coalition ahead of the election. So it's obviously it's not easy to do that. And the parties have agreed to come together in the following months still, to come up with a much more substantial engagement on shared policy, because in 2 days you cannot agree on each and every policy, but you can agree on the key policies. So they've done that, and so they commit to work on a fully fledged policy platform in the months to come, based on the pillars of the agreement that have reached today. Okay, so there is really the pillar policy agreements, and now they have to substantiate that much more fully in a fully fledged manifesto in the coming months. And obviously they also have to keep it, they can't be too close yet, because there's ongoing negotiations to bring in more parties to the coalition. So, also to give other parties the opportunity to make some input. But the core, the pillars have been agreed on, and it's a really significant moment for a group of parties that fought each other in the past to actually agree on the fundamentals of a policy platform. Okay. Second thing, they agreed on the principles of power sharing. And that's very important. If you think of all of, many of the coalitions that failed at a local level, it really has been, power sharing has been really an Achilles heel for many of the coalitions at a local level. And one of the reasons why many of the coalitions have failed, because they've been unable to agree on how to share power. Okay. So it was hard, very robust discussion. It was very hard, but an agreement has been reached. So what does it mean in practical terms? So the parties have agreed how they're going to work together, how they're going to, if they come to government, when they're going to come to government, how they're going to share power, how it's going to look like. How are they going to establish a government, and how would they allocate positions, and so on. Now, the principles of the power sharing that they've agreed on, what would the principles be? One, that power will be shared approximately proportional to the election result. So, it is important to emphasize that in this kind of coalition, and that every party will still have their individual identities, and they will compete in the election based on the individual identities, but part of a coalition. Again, it's very new in South African circumstances, very new. But once the election result is out, and they will then deal with representation among themselves according to the election results, how much each party would have gotten out of the election. Secondly, they'll use the principle of merit base to decide the allocation of positions in government. So, looking for the best candidate for a position, among them or outside, and that the appointment would, so they agreed to the principle of merit-based appointments. So not political-based appointment or patronage-based appointment or cadre-based appointments, but merit-based appointments. This is quite important. It's a very important principle that I've agreed on, and it sifts also really the way things are conducted in the country. They also agreed, thirdly, on the principle that the same party, for example, cannot lead both the executive and legislative arms of government. So, so among the coalition, if there's a party appointment, for example, in the executive, or the party dominance, one party dominant legislatively, in the executive, there would be, the same party cannot then be dominant in that same arena on the legislative arms. So, I mean, to explain it maybe a little bit, I think just to clarify it, to unpack that, so they'll try on principle to make certain that that the diversity of parties, firstly, are represented in both in executive positions and in legislative. So that's the first part of that. Yeah? So diversity of appointments across, so parties are represented in both legislative and in executive. Okay? So that's the first part of it. The second part of it would then be that one party, so if one party is, say, dominant in the executive, that same party wouldn't be on the legislative. So, I hope that makes sense, the explanation makes sense. Fourthly, under these principles of power sharing, they've agreed that the cabinet must reflect the diversity of the South African people. So it's quite a key, it's a very, very key. I mean, we are the world's most diverse society. Our diversity is our strength, and it's a very, very important thing about that. If you're South African, what differentiates you being a South African from being any other nationality is our diversity. And the coalition partners has made as a principle of appointments across, whether it's legislative or executive, that it will reflect the country's diversity, because that's it. I mean, it's our strength as a country. If we want to grow, we want to be prosperous, we want to be peaceful, we have to leverage that diversity, because that is actually our competitive advantage compared to any other country in the world. It's a competitive advantage, which we obviously haven't leveraged properly since 1994. So it's a principle. They've accepted that it's going to be a very, very key principle in the way they're going to govern. Because, I mean, that's, you know, as a country, countries must use the competitive advantage in order to prosper, to grow, to compete, and so on. And as a principle, their power sharing, I mean, the agreement was, from a power sharing principle, is going to, diversity is going to be a key pillar. They've agreed that lifestyle audits of all members of the executive will be implemented. Lastly, around these power-sharing principles, the agreements, they've agreed that the leader of the largest party in the bloc will become the leader of government, or government business. Okay. Now, it's quite important. I mean, in our governance structure right now, we have, whether it's in Parliament or in the provinces, the idea that, you know, there is a title, leader of government business, which hasn't been utilized in the way it had been envisaged by our constitutional framers when they framed the governing system, the post-1994 governing system. So essentially what the coalition decided, or what they agreed on, is that that position would become really what it was meant to be, in terms of, I mean, you just have to imagine when you're in a coalition at a national level, you would have, there would need to be a coordination of a policy program, a coordination of a legislative program, a coordination of an implementation, you know, so there has to be a central coordination to deliver on policy, to deliver on a legislative program, and so on, and that the leader of government business is going to be a key governance structure in that system of coordination, and that the party with that get the most votes will automatically take charge of their position. I mean, at the moment, for example, at the national level, the arrangement is that it will be the deputy president, so that's the arrangement currently now. So that will change within a coalition government. It would then change, really be a big change in the way governance operates at that level. The third big agreement has been that the parties have agreed to relook at the design of the national cabinet. They've accepted that the way the cabinet is structured right now, that is top-heavy. We've got one of the largest cabinets compared to our emerging market peers around the world. And on principle, although, you know, that with these sort of things, one has to really look at it more robustly, more evidence-based look at it. But on principle, they've agreed that the cabinet will be streamlined under coalition government. To conclude, it's been, I mean, these are parties that come with different identities, different backgrounds. They've been competing with each other in the past. Some of the, you know, their engagement with the past has been often hostile, been very rough, sometimes very toxic. So you can imagine trying to get them to agree and on common policies has been very challenging. It's been very robust, but it's been a good spirit. There have been no fisticuffs. can really put that. But it is, you know, it's been a very strong engagement from different parties. I mean, you know, strong individuals. I mean, individuals with very strong views, leaders of their parties. So to get them to compromise, and for them to compromise, really, I would commend the maturity of them. And I maybe want to give you a bit of a sense of how we tried to conduct, or how I've tried and with the team to do this convention. We try to do it a little bit differently from the normal conventional conferences that the political parties would be used to. So as I said, I opened all of the negotiations and prior to this convention with them with a prayer, which I myself wrote, with appeal to their hearts, and which appealed or tried to appeal to the maturity, to try to, you know, to appeal to them to become the best versions of themselves in a negotiation, to think about the country's interests first, always, at all times, at every decision, and even if it means sometimes to back down and to stay quiet and to think again. So the way we did it was, and then we had a briefing session with them. After the prayer, I know, we had Dr. Manga, which is one of certainly the leading specialists in terms of breathing meditation, to get them, you know, because in many of the situations people get agitated, they're very angry, sometimes very difficult to move from positions, you know, to calm down, moments, take a break, this should be still sometimes. You just imagine the leaders, just like, just go back and look at their photos. Just look at clips of them in action, so you can imagine what we had to try to do. I mean, we brought in Zanele Morrison to, who again is one of the leading experts in South Africa, to engage with them on an individual basis in terms of to get the trust going between them, because these are leaders who, as I say, have been hostile. I mean, they've been competing with each other, and now they have to build a coalition and work together. They only know each other through politics. You know, so we had an exercise of trying to get them to begin to get to know each other, their personal lives, their families, you know, their interests, because that's quite important. As a society, we have to get to know each other. So that we don't look at each other just through the eyes of black and white, and sort of easy evaluations of each other without knowing where people come from, what drives them, their purpose, what shaped them, what made them, where, you know, and so on. So we had that. Just to give you a sense of this journey to make this coalition possible, to make this agreement possible. So to conclude, we're on track. We're absolutely on track to deliver the first pre-election coalition in South Africa's modern history. We're almost there. Thank you.
Okay, so you've had the statement from Professor Gamedi, and you've heard, and we've tried to take you a little bit inside what it's been like in the negotiations. I said I'd take a few questions. What I'm going to try and do is ask different people than I asked yesterday. So the gentleman in the front with his hand up, the gentleman at the back who's waving his hand, Sunday Times. Okay, all right. And I didn't look that side. Okay, okay, and that gentleman there. Okay, so those are the questions I'm taking. Okay, for now, no. Okay, that's what I'm doing for now. That's the first round, and Professor Gumede will decide if he'll take more. So can I ask that the usual protocol will apply? There is a roving mic somewhere. Where is it? Zava? Okay, all right. And can I just ask you to remind you the rules? You say who you are, where you're from, and then you ask Professor. He will take those questions. Professor Gumede will answer them, and then if he wants to ask a few more, we'll see how we're going. And while you're all still listening, because we're on track, we think that we might come back and brief you at 5 and not 6. Okay. Okay.
From the SABC. My question to Professor Gumede is, I think, just two. Number one, we've heard that you've said the party with the largest bloc will lead government, will be the leader of government business. But as we know that in our parliament, it's parliament that elects the president. Understand that? As the coalition parties, who will they then forward as the preferred candidate for the president? And number two, will this agreement start now at the local level? Because, I mean, in Johannesburg, for example, some of the parties that are working together here couldn't agree in Johannesburg. Thanks.
Harry Harper, Bell. Has there been any discussion around the bills before Parliament introduced by the DA, which would put a cap on the participation in coalitions by bodies? I think they mooted the figure of 1%. How is that being navigated and negotiated with regards to this process? And then secondly, there had also been some discussion from the other parties regarding the idea of the necessity to kind of make a public declaration or an internal declaration of non-participation in the coalition with the ANC. Was that tabled? Was it discussed? And was there a resolution around that?
Okay. Hi, Prof. My name is Sisanda Mwele from the Sunday Times. Regarding fundraising and the sharing of resources, you've spoken to us about power sharing and how that will happen proportionally. But if the donor wants to give to the multi-party charter, how will those funds be shared among the parties to be used for campaign purposes? Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Prof. My name is Mawande. I work for the Sunday World. Perhaps to link my first question with Sisanda, my colleague's question, who is funding this particular convention? And I will expand on that special funding later on in the last press briefing. For now, I'll leave it at this convention. And then, secondly, you speak of an issue of a fully fledged manifesto for the multi-party charter. And then I get confused because what then happens to the individual manifestos of the individual parties? Also, isn't that room to confuse the voters of these individual parties? If one manifesto talks about one thing, which is inclusive of all parties, and then as individuals, they speak to ideology. I mean, looking there, it's Parties Freedom Front Plus, IFP, TA, ActionSA, their ideologies, political ideologies are completely different, and it's going to speak to their individual manifesto. But then how do you then make a difference between that and the manifesto for the entire party? Are you guys not jumping the gun, to put simply, and isolating voters way before the elections take place? Thank you very much.
Thank you for those questions. Just again as a reminder that I'm not a member of any of the participating political. That I'm an independent mediator and chair to get them over the line to have the coalition. Okay. So I think it's important to emphasize that. So it's also important to emphasize that the individual identity will be the individual identity. These parties will go into the election campaigning based on the individual identity, as you know, but they will once they will get and they've agreed on the sort of core things that unite them, but campaign on the individual platforms, the individual identities, and then have a common coalition program for government, which is based on the pillars that they've agreed on. And when they do that, they'll try to do, in a campaign, for example, to do it in such a way that they respect each other, but they also give each other the room to have their own identities. And obviously that is going to be a challenge which I have to manage. On the fundraising, I think those one of the issues, and shared resources for a campaign. So those some of the issues that's still being discussed, not yet resolved, but it is part of this ongoing discussions for the next few hours. So that hasn't been resolved. On the declaration. So what I can tell you that at the end of the day, there'll be a declaration. It's almost there. There will be a common declaration. So when it's concluded at the end of the day at 5 o'clock press conference, we know there's going to be a resolution. And there's going to be the key part of the announcement, and I guess that's the groundbreaking, the agreement, the declaration. On the bills before Parliament, so they're not there yet because this is really in terms of getting the core agreement to bed that down, and all of the other things will be discussed amongst them once they've got the agreement. I mean, the key thing is to get the agreement today. And that agreement will open the way for them to discuss other things, even, coalitions at a local level. They first have to get the agreement and get this charter, this coalition together and sign up and get a declaration. And from there onwards, they will then discuss and resolve all of the other common policy issues together. But it has to be agreement by the end of the day first, and then the next steps will follow thereafter. On the leader, there was a question in terms of what do we mean, because the way our system, our constitutional system works is that the election happens in Parliament. We don't have a presidential system. We have, after the elections, Parliament sits, and then the parties vote for a party leader. So I'll just tell you where the election is now. Principally, it's much more focused on getting this agreement. And then secondly, from a leadership point of view, that the parties, obviously remember the parties have to fight at their own, an election campaign as individual parties, but part of a broader collective. And then the outcome of the election will then determine, in terms of the party, who they would elect in Parliament as the president, if they're victorious. But I think the principle essentially, I think the most important thing, the principle is that it may not mean necessarily that the leader they elect would be the leader of the party with the most votes. And that's the broad principle. It's a principle. Okay. Right. I mean, that's the most I can say. On the funding, yeah. So, I mean, these are parties with parliamentary representation, so they've used their resources to try to make this work. I mean, it's in a coalition, you have to pool resources to do things together, and that's possibly one of the first things we have to do in these type of conventions. Okay. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you. and William, is that it? Okay, thank you very much, everyone. We're not going to take any more questions. We will remind you all that we know we said initially it would be at 6 o'clock. As Professor Kamedi has indicated, we're moving a little bit more. Yeah, we're not going to do it at 6. Yeah, I'm just saying we said initially at 6. I'm reminding you all that we'll come back at 5. And we are, as you have seen, trying to make sure that we stick to time. And there will be more questions, and it will be a full conference where you'll be able to ask questions. Thanks very much. Yeah.
All questions later.
Yeah. Well, you'll also be able to ask them of the politicians, which I think you would much prefer. Okay, that's what I mean. Okay. No, he doesn't know the answers. Okay. No, it is not from now. At 5 o'clock, it will be the politicians. And we're hoping. Yeah. No, I know. But guys, we're trying to get an agreement. Be a good South African. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Sorry, in terms of your agenda now, will you be
No. So I can just tell you.
It's national. Okay.
So I mean, I guess the best I could say, just get a nice psychologist together. Okay. So in these negotiations, I had to bracket the things that could break the negotiations on the other side. So, for example, those type of conflicts had to be put aside.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
In order to get the bigger.
So simply put, local government is not on the table.
Guys, remember this is a process. It's not an event.